Here is a red shimmering ink by Ancient Charm, the Phoenix.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a red, yet could also pass as a pink because of the way the shimmer plays on it. I don't mind a shimmering pink, but feel let down when it should be a shimmering red. So, cat's out of the bag, as I didn't enjoy this as much as I had expected. Even when it comes across as a red, it does so as a very pink-leaning red. So, I wish as a pink for it to be just a little more bold. Plus, if this was a pink, I think a silver shimmer, might have been a nicer choice. This is a hard pass for me.
The pen for today is a Franklin Christoph Model 66. All of the writing samples are done with
a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the extra fine nib, you see it very much looks like a pink with the shimmer. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We really do get a pretty decent performance, though the way the shimmer worked, and I do agitate the pens regularly, the shimmer mostly came out on the first lines and then kind of faded away. Now, there is some shading going on, which is less common for reds, a little more common for pinks. Maybe I'm wrong about the color, but I don't think so. I'm just, the shading when it does it is nice. I'm just very let down here. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It does shimmer, and fairly consistently. As it's down, I get a very pink-leaning red, much nicer color. Not a red for me, but a much nicer tone on the page than it was with the extra fine. The shimmer is fairly consistent throughout, so on certain angles you really get the gold writing, and others the pink-leaning red. Looking at the stub nib, it is right the same tone as it was with the medium. There is no feather, there is no spread, there is no shading, there is shimmer, and the shimmer is very consistent throughout the writing, so it's going down very nice. It shows that the particles are staying well suspended in the ink while I'm writing, so they're not settling too fast. Gives a pretty nice writing experience when this is the color that you're going for. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 5 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feather, has no spread, has no shading, has the shimmer coming through on a paper that's not made for fountain pens. Really doing a good job. The shimmer is especially standing out nice on that first and towards the end of the third line. So it's not that it's consistently shimmering, but the shimmer is definitely coming through on the paper, doing a very good job of it. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is no shading, there is a lot of shimmer. The shimmer really held up the whole way through, not being any kind of a problem. It didn't die off on me as I was writing, which sometimes shimmer inks will do, but this one did not with this pen, really giving that gold coming through on top of a darker, still pink leaning red. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, and the shimmer is coming through very strong, very consistent. There's very few spots in the writing that don't have shimmer on it. So again, at certain angles, you really do get a lot of that gold. And as you move, kind of makes you think of the chameleon paint that can go on cars, where it color changes from that gold to a pink leaning red. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it's just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but more pink is really coming through here. It really looks like a pink ink. Now, we're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread, we're not getting any shading or any of the shimmer coming through on this paper. It really just kind of ate it up and made it go away. Now, I think the pink that I'm getting here is much more pleasant for me to look at. It's a prettier pink than it was on the white papers. So if you really want this to be a pretty pink, this is a great way to go. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. It is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is red and not a pink leaning red. It is red. Thank you. Finally. With no feathering, with no spread, with hints of the shimmer throughout, no hints of shading at all. And that's okay. I don't really expect shading on red inks. I've done enough of them to sort of not expect that there. And I think this looks very nice. This paper is really making this ink perform much better in terms of its color. Now, we are getting the shimmer here, and it's not consistent. It's not the whole way through. But when it is there, it is very nice. So I think it's just adding a little bit of something onto the paper, which is nice. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tiny bit lighter than it was with the medium nib, still darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. The color is not as red as it was with the medium, and we start to see a little bit of that pink lean coming through that I'm not especially fond of. Now, there's no feathering and there is no spread. There is maybe a spot or two where some shading shows up. You see it in scratching on the third line, and that's practically it. You get a couple of moments that the shimmer shows through, but very rarely. So I don't really even want to point out the shimmer because it's really only in one or two tiny spots. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, We get no feathering, we get no spread. We get the shimmer showing nicer than it did on the Clairefontaine. There's shading going on, and I think it's doing a nicer job here than it did on the Clairefontaine. Look at the word without. Starts as a midtone, gets a bit darker, drops to a midtone after the H, darker at the T. And when this is getting darker, the shimmer is really showing itself off very nicely on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. We are getting some shading. You see it on fully on the third line, or it's dreadfully from second to third line. You see it a little bit on chestnut on a third line, though on a majority what we're getting is a nicer red than we had before on the Clairefontaine. It's being red, which I'm very much appreciating. Looking at the stub nib, you have to ignore those first words because I walked away and set the pen down on a paper towel and it was drawing ink out of the nib. So that very pink writing is my fault. I let it sit for a couple of minutes and resaturate the nib, and then we got this darker color we're getting. You know, this darker color that is red and not pink, and not a pink leaning red. It is darker than it was with the medium, much darker than it was on the Clairefontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading, with the shimmer coming through very strong, really consistent the whole way through. I can move the paper and see gold and move it and red, and I think it's looking very nice here. The gold with red works very well, but I'm going to stand by when it is pink. It should have been a silver. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write back here because this is no problem.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Franz Kafka Dark Red. Here is Noodler's Dragon's Napalm. Here is Pen BBS 235. Here is Sailor Kobe number 4. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It is more red leaning pink than it was the pink of the Clairefontaine. Now we get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading. We are getting some of the shimmer coming through, which is kind of a surprise on this paper. That's where it starts to look darker or more of the red tones than it did on the Clairefontaine. It looks very nice here. I think this is a pretty decent performance on this paper. I still wouldn't recommend doing this in your lab class because it probably wouldn't be appreciated, but I'm smearing it with my finger and I am not seeing the shimmer smear. The shimmer is holding steady on this paper. So that could be a huge plus side here. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it is absolutely shading. Yes, it absolutely is giving shimmer, and a lot of shimmer. Really, I'm surprised at how much shimmer it really has. It has almost as much shimmer as I was seeing on the premium papers. Really very shocking as a performance. Incredibly pleasing, truly. And it's not smearing when I slide my finger over it on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium nib. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get no shading. We are getting the shimmer and strong. This entire bit of writing, as I turn it, I see shimmer. And as I turn it the other way, I see a darker red leaning pink, still red leaning or pink leaning red. I said it backwards the one time. It's a pink leaning red. It's still there, but the shimmer is coming across very strong, very nice. And I can see a student that would enjoy using this, enjoying it. And since it doesn't smear, hopefully that teacher wouldn't go ahead and take any points away from them. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with the ghosting, so you can easily write back here and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Kaweco Midnight Blue.
Here is a gray ink by Sailor Bungu Box Melancholic Gray.
Here is a blue ink by Cross Blue. Here is a black ink by Diamine Onyx. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. It's still pink. There's moments of shading, and there's nothing for the shimmer. It really devours the shimmer into this paper. The fibers make it entirely disappear. I feel like using this ink on this paper makes it lose some of its best qualities, which is really a shame when people use cheap paper, nice pen, and nice ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread. Neither the feather or the spread are any kind of a real issue here. You know you're using a medium and it's going to come out like a broad. You know it's going to be a feathery monster, so we can get over that. Take a breath. That aside, I don't like what I see. There's no shading, there's no shimmer, and in general, I'm like, eh. But if this was in my pen and I had to write something on this paper, I guess I would, but that's the reason I keep nicer paper at work. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers like a monster. Yes, it spreads into an even bigger feather monster. No, it doesn't shade. No, it doesn't shimmer. But it is red on this paper, not a pink leaning red, but a red. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and give it a golf clap. Enough of the golf clap, I guess. Looking at the back of the page, we get a lot of ghosting. You can't write back here and be able to read both sides well, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
All of the pens used were a medium flow, and the fine and the stub both pointed this to be a disappointing red-leaning pink or even a disappointing pink. It's only with the medium nib that it got darker and became more of a red with a slight pink lean. So I would recommend a medium to wet, medium, or broad nib. This is not about the flow for the shimmer, much more about getting the tone to a tone I would enjoy the most. That being said, that's me choosing the tone. So if what you saw from different pens or from different nibs was the tone you'd want, then maybe a medium flow pen really does it for you if you like that kind of pink lean to it.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.